Welcome back to Debut Writers. We are happy to be back with our fourth series, Start to Finish of Writing Your Book. So, in the last series, we discussed finding your writing process, and this really dealt with getting your book pitched, developing your characters, how to keep up the pace. But now we're really going to dive into the details of writing your book.
Whether that's a fantasy, romance, horror, or any genre, your book really needs to follow a beat sheet, at least to start. This is so much more than just a plot. It's a structure in which events need to happen in your story, and most importantly, when they happen. Now, we know, and we're guilty of this too, every writer likes to take their detours, but that's why you have a beat sheet that lays out a clear, transformative journey for your main character, and it should definitely be the foundation, especially as debut writers.
Yeah, and what we're really basing all of this off of is Save the Cat writes a novel. So it's a this guy Blake did all this research, right? And he was a screenwriter and he developed a series of 15 story beats. And he was like, this is the universal key to unlock every successful story. And if you follow this, then your story will progress in a way that keeps the readers engaged and on it. Like I was watching Fall Guy the other night. Love Ryan Gosling. Oh my God.
Love
I
him.
forget how much I absolutely adore him, but the story dragged. I mean, it dragged and dragged, and I'm
Oh,
like running the beat.
bummer.
I know I'm like running the beat sheet in my mind, and I'm like, okay, you're not getting to the catalyst quick enough, and that debate took way too long. And so, like, I'm now so familiar with this beat sheet that I am just like I'm putting everything into it, and I'm seeing when I really like a story how naturally it falls into that versus when I'm feeling like something's missing or we're not getting to it or like it just isn't moving right for me. I can tell like, oh, this is what we're missing and we're not getting to it soon enough. So that's why I thought this would be really great to kind of like piece it out episode by episode. So it's like the three act structure. So we'll talk about act one, and then in the next episode, act two, act three, and then we'll talk about two a little bit how maybe you can deviate from that story if that really is your jam, if you really are trying to break the mold. But you really have to understand it before you break it.
That's what I was just going to say. And we've talked about that before. Detours and everything, they're not necessarily a bad thing. And especially for your creativity and whatnot. But it's much better to go ahead and do that once you actually understand this. And as debut writers, if you haven't written anything before, you might not. I was just going to say though, isn't it interesting though, as we've been studying like the craft of storytelling, how you do apply that to other things that you read and everything that you watch. I've noticed that I've been doing that with almost everything, and when I'm reading now and talking to authors, I'm just even more excited to talk to them about what their process was like to do all of that, how they put the puzzle pieces together for their book specifically. It's so fascinating.
Yeah. And so, what Bree and I were just talking about this before we started the episode. I got recently inspired and I started a whole nother book, but I am religiously following the beat sheet. Like, I'm going back and I'm not labeling my chapters like chapter one, chapter two. I'm labeling them. This is my opening image. This is my theme statement. These are my setup chapters. This is my catalyst. This is my debate. I'm checking word count. Am I 10% through my book? Am I 50% through my book? I need to be at the midway. So, what's happening next in my story? So, a little bit of a pantsing with a plan. What did I see the other day? And it was like a planter.
I
Are
was gonna
you
say
planting
planting it.
plants? Like that is me to a T.
I think I heard Jenny Myers say once that she was like that she called herself a planter. If I'm recalling correctly, it was like an in-person conversation. I almost like that. I know we've talked a lot about outlining before, and I kind of like that more as an outline. I've been writing and outlining a story too, and I've been doing the same thing with outlining mine like that rather than chapter one, chapter two. Every now and then I've kind of like thrown in, oh, I think this is chapters 1 through 4 or whatever.
Yeah.
It was interesting too. I was working with an author on the developmental edit side of things, and I was like, the story is there, but the structure isn't. We're not really introducing the theme right away. We don't understand what this character arc is going to be, all of this. And so when I laid it out for them in a response, you I love Save the Cat. I think it's awesome. And I constantly refer back to it, which is why we talk about it all the time. And I used a lot of yeah, I use a lot of information to say this is ultimately where we want to get to. And some of that's going to require further storytelling and developing these. Some of it's just going to require restructuring chapters. Like they're
Mhm.
not in the right location. We need to move some things around.
So what I started doing is, because again, I'm just such like an inspired writer. I can't just be like, sit down, think of an idea, or sit like down and write. So like I have to like have that burst of creativity, right? And so I had was up at the lake, like I always get my burst of creativity. So I got it up there and I just started writing. And for probably a solid 2 weeks, I wrote. And then all of a sudden I had that aha moment where I was like, I know where the story's going. Like I had like the general like base idea of what it was about, but then it was like this moment of like, oh my goodness, that's where this story is going. That's the end. That's the twist. That's what's going to make this book amazing. And so now I
That
start writing.
epiphany moment is so good.
Awesome. So I like stopped immediately and I went and I outlined it. So it's like I started writing just to like get the juices going. And then once that moment of like, this is what the story fully is, I stopped and I was like, let me put this in an outline because I'm going to forget. So it's like,
I love that. No, I think that that's great advice. It's just showcasing like a different way to do it because we've said this before. All of this is sort of like general great good practices to follow, and then you need to figure out how that works for you. So, like how you did, you're like, I just kind of wrote to let the creativity flow, figure out where things were going, probably understand your characters a little bit too, because
mhm.
sometimes we don't know everything about them to start. So you need to get into the story to see that. And then you can really take a step back when you have that moment and feel free to send any of those vibes my way.
Yeah.
That would be great.
I am sending all the vibes your way.
Yeah.
But so well, and that was the thing too when I was first introduced to the beat sheet and I really started to, and I know it so well now because every author that I've worked with, I've like hammered it into their head and I've like ripped their book apart and reorganized it within this structure. And they're like, yes, that's exactly how this needs to go down. I'm like, it's so much better now. So like the
That's good because my experience, well, and this was just one person that I'd worked with on it, but one person was so taken aback by
Mm.
the feedback. And I mean, in general, like they really kind of shut it down. And that almost goes back to series one, in my opinion, of someone that hadn't really thought about what their goals were for their book.
Yeah.
When because we've talked about it, but like this is it's a long game for sure. And but if you know this from the get-go, it can kind of help with some of the editing process. But there's a reason these structures work, and a lot of stories, if you recognize it and you know what the 3 act structure is, you'll start to see it in the things that you're reading or
And
watching.
it'll be your successful books too. You'll see them like, oh, okay, this is why this book was successful. It's following that pattern. I was just talking to an author this morning that I'm helping with her developmental edit, and I'm trying to tell her, I'm like, every chapter kind of needs, because it's a self-help book. I'm like, it needs to follow the same pattern. We are creatures of habit. We love routine.
We
And
do.
when you're breaking that routine, sometimes it's like you break the routine and magic happens. And you're like, there are books out there that do that. But for the most part, in order to like kind of guarantee that success, following these patterns, giving the reader what they want is a really, really big thing. And that's why we talk about that target audience and the purpose of your book and all those things in series one, which actually, side note, I got asked to teach a creative writing course specifically on book development for my son's middle school, which is so much fun because
That's
these kids are
awesome.
just so jazzed about getting to write about whatever they want. That was their big thing. They're like, we can write whatever we want. I'm like, yeah, like whatever. They're like, no, like no restrictions. Like it doesn't have to be about, you know, this book that we read. And I'm like, nope, you can
Nope.
write whatever you want. And I'm
That's
going to
awesome.
teach you how to do that. And so these first couple of classes have been all about that. Like the things you need to know before that you need to know your genre, your target audience, the point of view you're going to write in, like now we're about to shift into character development because that's so incredible. Character drives stories. So like as much as we're doing this beat sheet and you have to follow this beat sheet, like if you don't have a character to push your story along, go back and listen to the character development episode. I can't remember which one that was, but like go back because your character needs to be pushing this story along. So you're not just like, it's not scenes that push it along. The character is moving through these scenes. So just keep that in mind as well, too.
Absolutely. So let's dive into Act One and what exactly should we be focusing on to include in that section?
So something that I learned with Act One was that opening image, and I get it. I visually see every story I write, and I always want to start a story like a movie with that like real like opening, like dramatic, like a really important scene, right? That's going to set the tone, which it does. But what I didn't realize is that your opening scene really needs to match your closing scene. So that was something for me that was kind of like, okay, so as I'm thinking about the opening scene of my book, I also need to make sure that that's how I plan to close the book. So, like, wherever the character is and they're super flawed, super, present day mindset, you're going to show them changed and better in that same space at the very end of the book in your closing scene. So this you find this a lot when people do those like 7 years later or 6 months later. It's because they're attaching that opening scene to a final scene. So it's kind of a really I do it, but I feel like it's kind of like a really like easy way to be like in dramatically, but then also like have that closing scene that's expected to connect to the opening scene. So I thought that was interesting. I'd never realized that.
No, that's a really great point. I hadn't either. And so, but it's something to really think about as you're trying to write that. And I mean, almost in my head, the opening scene, whatever you start with, it could change drastically by the time you finish your manuscript. Because then when you get to that end or you have that epiphany, you're like, oh, this is really what it needs to be. So you can always go back and change it too, but you do need to have that opening image. You also need to state your theme. And this is one thing I'm finding people aren't doing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it to me, it seems maybe it's just because we've been reading and talking about it, but I'm like, this is the most almost the most obvious part of Act One. But I'm seeing more and more where people aren't really getting to their theme or they're hiding it so much that it's not stated clearly for the reader.
Yes, I totally agree. And you've got to also remember that this opening image, opening scene image, whatever it is for you, and that theme statement, these are within those first 10 pages. And guess what a literary agent asks for? Your first 10 pages. So, this is
Shocker.
probably the most important part that you're writing in your book because it really is setting kind of like that think of an accelerated or larger elevator pitch for your book. So you've hooked them with the book hook, right? You've hooked them with your query. Now you're sitting your first 10, 15 pages and they're going, okay, what is this opening scene? What is the present day? And then what is going to be the theme of this book? What are we really going to take away? If that's not present in those pages, then the agent is left thinking, I have no idea what this book is about. Like, so why am I going to keep reading it?
Exactly. Your theme is really going to help set up what exactly the journey is for your main character or main characters. And that needs to be said, not necessarily in an obvious way, but in a way that we know exactly what the theme is.
And something that I thought was interesting too is your main character can't say it.
No,
So it has to be some other character in your book has to like make this kind of like statement of what is really going to be like the theme of the book.
right. Because if your main character says it, then they know their character arc, and that would be
Yeah.
weird.
So then so after you've got like this is present day, this is what this book is going to be about because again, in that character that theme statement is probably most likely pointing out the character's like major flaw that you're like really heavy on the surface in those first images, right? So then you have the setup. And this is where it's the status quo of your character. And the more flaws you can give your character, the better. I mean, people just really like a broken person, I think. We just really connect with these people when they're just, like, really, like, just awful.
Yeah, it's heavy. I mean, it's very heavy on relatability to an extent. I mean, you're also often their brokenness or their flaws, their imperfections, whatever they may be, there's generally the setup behind the character. Why are they the way that they are? And that's often going to relate to what their arc is and what the theme is overall, too. So we need to know why they are that person. So I'm sure sometimes it's relatability. I think some of it depends a little bit on the genre. It's not always this like direct connection of, oh man, like I'm an assassin too. Like, no, I'm not. But you're figuring out why they are the way they are and then ultimately what's motivating them
Yeah.
through these different scenarios.
Yeah, I think we talked about, like, I always have, like, the main character in A Lost Woman and then the main character in the book I'm reading right now, they're both drunks. And it's just like that's their big flaw, right? We drink too much. And we kind of talked about how that's almost my fear is that, I will become these main characters. So it's like I write about it to process, like, hey, it could get that bad. So, like, maybe like watch how much you're drinking.
I think well, and we've talked about this before, it's really normal to have a piece of you in
Mhm.
nearly every character or every character. And sometimes there are things that are really deep within you that are either a possibility or it's something that you dig into and you're like, okay, if that was my entire personality and that was what I did, but you're putting a piece of it in every single one. I was telling you before we started recording, I just talked to Randy Rebai, who just had a new book come out this month in August, and his story follows there's four main characters, four timelines, and he goes, I think with every single one, there's at least a characteristic or a quality of myself in every character because otherwise, as a writer, I couldn't really connect with
Yeah.
them. So, and I think that that's really normal and natural to do. And we've said before too, if it's not you, then it can be somebody else and you can always change all of that. But it's really normal to do that. I've talked with DL Jennings too, who wrote fantasy, and like my horrible example, I was like, I'm not an assassin, but you're learning about the character. But with his fantasy characters too, I mean, he was like, that's me, that's the younger version of me on a quest, and then this character
Yeah.
was this person, but just in this fictional fantasy world. So lean into either yourself, even if it's just a sliver of who you are, and then really get into the details of what that would be like, or other people.
And there's a reason they say writing is therapeutic.
Yes.
You're writing to maybe escape and be somebody who you wish you were, but you're not necessarily. Or I feel like I'm always writing to not be the person I write about, but more so to understand like the transformative power of like what can happen throughout a character in a story. Processing that, I feel like I'm always processing a little bit of something that I'm going through in my life and I'm trying to overcome and I'm trying to transform from. So even though it's a more dramatic experience for this character because I'm, leveling it up for them to make it more engaging, there is still like a little piece of me and the transformation that I want to go through.
Yeah, it similarly, I told you about the story idea that I abandoned a while ago. But
Which is good. You should go back to it.
but is it the genre I want to sit in? I don't know.
I know that's the hard thing. Maybe you could push it into your genre. Maybe you could keep those characters and their core story, but place them into the fantasy space you also created.
Maybe. That's a good idea. But that was so similarly, I mean, reflecting on things that were personal, but putting them in a fictional setting. But I was definitely digging into, okay, what are all of the different possibilities? How could my life have turned out
Huh.
different? And that was what I was really digging into. And not just my life, but then the other core character in that book. I was like, this could have gone in a totally different path, albeit a very dramatic one. where like the possibilities of that happen small, yes, but you're creating something based off of a real experience or a real quality. And I think a lot of it had to do with, for me, like if you're doing some self-reflection or have self-awareness and you kind of mm, realize that there's like a certain characteristic or quality, and then you take that and run with it, even if that's not who you are today, but really digging into what the possibilities are of that is, it's fascinating to me.
One day I will rewrite my own sliding doors. If you have not seen that
Yes.
movie from the 90s, or maybe it was the 2000s, it's with Gwyneth Paltrow and it's
Yes.
phenomenal. They actually, I think Netflix has like a remake of it, but
Do they
it's,
really?
yeah, but it's not like, it's not the same situations, but it's the same idea of sliding doors where like you either made the train or you didn't make the train, and how you had two different projections of your life. I just love that because
Oh,
I think it's because I always second guess my decisions, and I'm like, God, what if I decided the other way, or what if I did this instead? I'm always second guessing myself.
I'm definitely fascinated by that same thing too. Another one similarly, and then we need to get back on topic, but I'll just mention it. Is, oh my gosh, why am I gonna? I'm gonna totally butcher what the title of the book is, and I just talked to her. Oh my god, give me 2 seconds. I'm so embarrassed that I didn't. Things Don't Break on Their Own by Sarah Easter Collins. This was one thing she was digging into in her book. It had a lot to do with, so I'm relating it to the whole sliding doors, like maybe in another life sort of situation, but it's not the same. But this um, perception of memory and how our memories are not, they're they're what you
You're an
make them.
unreliable narrator.
Yes, they are, and they're what you make them. And so you have all of these people at a dinner party, and ultimately, if you asked all of those people 6 months later what they recall, they would have drastically different memories from that evening. And her book, like, that's just one part of the entire story, but so similar to me. It's very interesting. And you can, if you find those little things that you want to dig into, can make a really, really good book.
Oh, I'm reading that one. I'm putting that one on my list. I am currently reading Sloane's book, the Everything We Never Said. So good. I
Yeah, I
love
liked it. That
this
was it's
book.
a page turner. It's a page turner. Okay, back to Act One. So we've talked.
Okay.
You need opening image. You need your theme. You need to start to set up your character. What are the other two things we need to include?
Of course, the catalyst. So, like, you've got to propel your character into the story that you are creating. So, that's what that catalyst is. And it's within the first 10% of your book. So, if you're writing like 80,000 novel, 80,000 word novel, that's within the first like 8,000 words. Did I do that math correctly? I'm not good at math. I feel like that
I'm
was,
not good at math either. We're not here
I
for the
should have
math.
I should have done the math before, so I knew for sure, but I think it's 8,000. Um, and it's not good that my sons are like incredibly brilliant and my husband at math. They make fun of me constantly, but I digress. The catalyst has to be, basically all we're saying is it has to be very soon. So when you're thinking about the setup, you're not spending a ton of time setting up that character. That can just be a single scene of like your character's status quo. You do not have to dive into their entire life and what it is right now. Just focus on that setup. Focuses on, okay, what is the author's, or what is the character's status quo that's drastically about to change?
Yeah, that's another common mistake that I see is the catalyst not happening soon enough.
Yes.
Um, and that is, I mean, that's really going to be what drives the majority of your story. You need to get to it. Like,
Yes.
don't drag it out too far, because that's, I think that that's where you run into a lot of readers saying, I'm having a hard time getting into this book. It's really, the setup is really dragging out. I don't know what's going on. And I
Yeah.
think the catalyst is like a common mistake when people are saying that. Not always. I'm not trying to generalize too much, but I do think that that's a pretty easy correlation to that.
Yes. And so then you have the last piece of Act One is the debate. And again, the catalyst is like a moment, an inciting incident. It's not this thing to be like detailed out over 3 chapters. It really is a very quick, like, oh my gosh, this is how it's changing. Now we're on a new path. But before we can get on the new path, the character actually has to decide to go on the path. Like, there's this catalyst, something's changing. The world is going to be upside down as we go into act two. But there has to be this debate where the character is like, how am I going to handle this change? How am I going to handle this incident? Am I going to go down path A, or am I going to go like sliding doors, path B? It's you have to show your character's mindset into what decision they're going to make, because then that propels you into act two, which is, the totally different world that you're in now.
Yes. So all of that, those, let's see, right? That's 5 elements.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm like, more math.
Clearly not an author strength.
Oh, sorry. There will be no math in my novel. Or it'll be like a test
Yeah.
that you epically fail. Um, it's really only like 20% of your book.
Yes.
So
So it's like such a small, incredibly small portion of your book. So you've got to take that into account too. In writing my novel right now, I went back because I got to a point in the story and I thought, I'm 60,000 words in. Like, I've got to start wrapping this up at some point, like, because it should only, like, 80's a big novel for mystery, thriller, the psychological stuff that I write, right? I'm not fantasy. I'm not getting up to 90 or 100. That's like too big for me. But so I went back and I looked at my setup chapters and I thought, oh my God, there's way too many setup chapters, way too many. So I went back and I changed it to where it's like, and what's interesting is I didn't really have to change that much about the story. I just didn't realize what the catalyst truly was. I was thinking that the catalyst was like actually seeing the dead body, but that's not what it was. That was going to be the all is lost moment for her, like almost towards the end. The catalyst was the very first moment she thought she saw the dead body. So
oh,
that was what kind of propelled her into writing this story about her neighbor that she's stalking. That's what the story's about. And so I
there
went
you
back and I
go.
was like, it was all there. I just had labeled it wrong. Because I honestly didn't realize how many words I was chunking out. I was like, oh, wow. I'm like blowing through this thing.
I'd say that's a good problem to have because on the flip side, where I'm at is like act one for me, it was immediately in my head. I knew exactly how it was going to play out and I could easily see it. Like I outlined it, could write it, all of that. Next week we're getting into act two and that's definitely where I struggle a bit. So
It's the meat of your novel. It's like, and they call it the dreaded middle for a reason, because
it's so true.
it can drag out for so long and you can really lose the reader. So if you follow what we'll talk about next week in act two, it really prevents you from kind of falling flat in the middle of your book, which happens a lot for authors.
Maybe it'll be good timing for me. So
There you go. Get a
and
little sciads.
hopefully for you if you're listening or watching. So we've talked a lot and we're going to continue talking about it, but if you haven't, Save the Cat Writes a Novel, definitely need to get that, especially if you are writing a new book, want to understand the craft of storytelling. We highly recommend, and we're not the only ones that would recommend that to you. And then
Every editor would probably
yes,
recommend that book.
yeah, it's not just us. And then don't forget to subscribe to our Substack newsletter so that you can have digital access to a beat sheet, as well as our tips that we send out with every series. And then join us again for episode 2 of this series next week.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Debut Writers. Make sure to check out our newsletter for your 3 T's and subscribe to never miss an empowering conversation.
Stay inspired and keep writing.